Okay. Well, good morning, Judge Cochran. I just want to start off by getting you to tell us your name, when and where you were born, and a little bit about your family.
Well, I was born a long, long time ago. In fact, next month I'll be 95 years old. I was born in Staunton, and both of my parents were born in Staunton.
What were their names?
Well, my father's name was Peyton Cochran, had no middle initial, and my mother's name was Susie. Actually, I think she was baptized as Susan, but she was always called Susie Baldwin Robertson. And she was, let's say, she was also born in Staunton. And I think, well, on my father's side, the Cochrans were among the early settlers of this county, and they lived out in the county. They had a big farm in the northern part of the county, and for several generations they lived out there. My grandfather Cochran, the first, well, he was George Moffett Cochran Jr., was probably the first of the family to go to college, and he graduated from University of Virginia, I think, college and law, and began to practice law several years before the Civil War in Staunton. When the war came along, he joined up. The family legend is that he went down to Harper's Ferry and tried to get a commission as an artillery officer with Stonewall Jackson, but he had very poor eyesight and was turned down for it. So they formed a local regiment in the Confederate Army, the 52nd Infantry Regiment, and his great friend, Colonel John Baldwin, became colonel of that regiment, and he became captain and quartermaster, and he spent 4 years in that position in various operations around the state of Virginia, and outside too, for that matter, and came back after the war and resumed the practice of law, got married, had a bunch of children, and had a very successful law practice.
How many siblings did you have?
I had a brother, a sister and a brother. My sister was 4 years younger than I, and my brother was 10 years younger than I.
And did both of them stay in this area?
Well, they're both dead now. My sister died. She married and had children, and she died several years ago. My younger brother, unfortunately, killed himself in about 1956. Oral history release agreement. Do I give that to you?
Yes. Thank you. I'll send it up to them. Thank you so much. And they'll make a copy for you and send it back to you.
All right, fine.
Well, let me back up for a minute. We were talking earlier about your upbringing, and you showed me a picture of a woman who was your nanny. And it was such an interesting story. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about her.
Well, I'm sure I wasn't the first in our family connection to use her as a nurse in infancy, but I was the oldest grandchild, and so she was known to our family, and they persuaded her to come and look after me, which she did for several years, and she was just a very fine person, and we were all devoted to her, and she as far as I know, was never married. But she had a great many relatives and friends in the community. And she had been a slave and had lived around here and continued to live around here after the Civil War, and was a very popular figure. Certainly it was with my family and me.
What was her name?
Her name was Nancy Wright.
Okay. And she was pretty old when she was taking care of
Yeah,
you.
she was. She was old. I mean, she was probably in her 80s then. And we called her Mammy. But Nancy Wright was her name.
Well, can you go back a bit to some of your ancestors? Talk a little bit about some of the earliest ones that you know about and what they did.
Well, on the other side, on my mother's side, her mother was Margaret Stuart, and her father was Alexander H.H. Stewart, who was a right distinguished man in his time. He served in the Virginia legislature, both I think in the House and the Senate probably. He went to Congress and stayed just one term, never ran for re-election. He was appointed Secretary of the Interior by President Fillmore and is credited with having organized that department. He was not the first. There was either one or another ahead of him, but both, for one reason or another, only lasted a few weeks because of illness, I think, something else. And so I've never been in the Department of Interior, but I understand that he is credited with actually organizing that department. And he was in that position, I think, for several years. And he was a Whig, and Fillmore is considered one of the poorest presidents we ever had, I think. But my ancestor stuck by him, and of course he was swept out. But that ancestor, men in politics in those days stood on principle lots of times when it didn't help him any. For instance, he was a great friend of Henry Clay's, and he worked hard to get him elected president at one time. But Clay said he'd rather be right than president, and he was. He never was president. and a lot of them acted that way, I think. They're some right strong-minded people in public office in those days. And after the war, he was unanimously elected to Congress again, but he couldn't serve because you had to take the oath that you hadn't helped the Confederacy. Well, he had. Although he had voted against secession, when the vote was taken, he did everything he could. He was too old to serve, but he had a couple of his sons had died before the war, but one was a student at VMI, and he fought with the cadets at Newmarket. So he wasn't permitted to do that. He formed a committee of 9, and they negotiated with the federal government and succeeded in getting Virginia relieved from a lot of the burdens of Reconstruction a long ways ahead of most of the other southern states. And in that connection, Johnson was succeeded by General Grant as president. And my great-grandfather came back on the train from Washington where he felt he'd worked everything out, And the train stopped in Charlottesville, and Mr. John B. Minor, who ran the law school at the university, came down to the station looking for him and found him and said that he congratulated him on what he had done, but he said, "Do you know what the military governor in Richmond is doing?" And he said no. He said, he doesn't understand the understanding that you have reached, or he's not going to comply with the terms. And he said, "You'd better get in touch with President Grant or everything will fall apart." So my ancestor was smart enough to get a Republican lawyer from Harrisonburg to deliver a personal memorandum from him to President Grant, the burden of which was, "I know that you're an honorable man," and he said, "This understanding which we have reached with the Senate was an understanding reached by men of honor. And for some reason or other, the military governor in Richmond either doesn't understand or is not inclined to comply with this understanding that has been reached. I'm sure that you will see to it that he's straightened out." Grant did it immediately.
That's very interesting. Now, is this a story that was passed down to you from your father, or how did you learn about this?
My grandfather Robinson wrote a biography of Alexander H.H. Stewart, and it's in there. And a lot of the original records are in the rare book library at the University of Virginia, the Alderman Library. A lot of the Stewart papers over there that would verify that.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your life. Your ancestors are very, very interesting, and I'm sure that helped to kind of give you a perspective about your place here in Virginia. And when you were growing up here, where did you go to school?
I went to the local high school and graduated there. But I was quite young, really too young to go to college. And so my father sent me to Episcopal High School up at Alexandria. And I liked it up there a great deal, and thought I'd like to graduate, come back a second year and graduate. The only difficulty was to graduate up there, you had to have either 4 or 5 years of either Latin or Greek. But I'd had 4 years of Latin, and so I did graduate. And at that time, my graduating class up there was just 14. But probably 50 boys left at the end of the year for college. And the headmaster was a man of such prestige, certainly in Charlottesville, where he'd been quarterback on the football team long by 1900, that if he said somebody was ready to do the work at the university said send him on down. And so about 8 of that class of 14, 1 went to Harvard, 2 went to Yale, 1 went to Princeton, and 1 went to MIT. And then the rest of them went to the University of Virginia. But then another 25 or so that didn't graduate but were ready for college came right down there and did just fine. Mr. Hodgson said they were ready, and so the university said we're ready.
So what were your experiences like at UVA? What did you, what activities did you get involved with?
I didn't do anything worthwhile there at all. I just enjoyed myself, I think, but I never took a drink until I was 21. I was considered right peculiar. My grandmother had told me that if I didn't drink or smoke until I was 21, she would give me a gold watch. So I said, all right, I'll see what I can do. And so I did, and I was the only person, I'm sure, in my class over there that didn't drink or smoke, certainly drink. And I really was. I was considered a right peculiar fellow. And unfortunately, the summer before I was 21, my grandmother died. It was very, very careless of her. And
So you never got your gold watch?
yes, I did, because her 3 sons were executors of her estate, and I told them what the understanding I had with grandmother was. And they said, all right, you stay into it until you're 21, another 6 months, and we'll see to it you get the watch. And so I did, and they did. And I've got it today, and it works perfectly. Of course, nobody uses pocket watches now, but I bring it out when I put on evening clothes.
That's something. So
then I did what a lot of people did in those days. Went 3 years to the college and then on over to law school, and they counted my first year of law as my major in college, and I got my BA degree, and I got a BA because I was taking Latin. You see, in those days, everybody got a BS. All my classmates got BS because none of them had taken Latin or Greek. Well, I had taken Latin, and so I was one of the few in my class that got a BA degree. Of course, they've changed all that, as they should. But unless you took Latin, you couldn't get a BA back in the 1930s over there.
So what made you go into law?
Well, just laziness. I guess I just assumed it was, I could stay over there for one. I'd have done an awful lot better if I'd gone someplace else. But that never occurred to me at all.
Uh-huh.
If you could give them a check for $10 and the check didn't bounce, you were all right in getting in law school.
So you went on to law, and who were some of your major professors who influenced you in law school? Do you remember?
Well, they only had 6 professors in the law school now. Now they've probably got 75 full professors and another 50 adjuncts over there. I've never seen anything like it. But the law school was about 30, enrollment was about 300 then. And Dean Dovey, who was a character, if there ever was one, and he'd been a great friend of my father's in law school. And I knew him. He'd been in our house a number of times. And Hardy Dillard was a professor of contracts, and he was another very colorful character. And they were unique. You see, each one of them was a real personality. And so with only 6 of them, you knew your professors. Mm-hmm. And it was a delightful experience.
Do you think that you learned a great deal from them, or was it just the atmosphere that you grew up in that really helped to?
Well, the whole thing was, but I wasn't. I didn't excel at all. I wasn't on the law review. Never occurred to me to try for it, and so anyway, it was. I lived on the lawn. My first year in law school, there were a bunch of us who had been friends from our first year. And our first year there, we joined different fraternities, and we decided then that we would reunite together our 4th year. And we'd do it by getting rooms on the lawn. I mean, you didn't have to be a hotshot to get a room on the lawn then. If you knew the dean's secretary, I've forgotten her name now, but she ran everything over there. And if Miss Edna, or whatever her name was, if she thought you ought to be on the lawn, you went on the lawn.
So you learned how.
Oh, yes, indeed. And so I'm sorry to say that I met Katie Couric back here several years ago, and I was distressed to find that did not live in my room on the lawn. She lived next door. It's a great sorrow for me. But my next door neighbor was a great friend of mine. His name was Fritz Nolting, and he became later on our ambassador to Vietnam. And well, anyway, after he retired, he went back and was head of the Miller Center there in the early days for several years before he died. He was a great friend, and my roommate for several years got another. He was there with another room, and we just had a group of those of us who had been friends ever since that first year at university.
And so, at the end of your years in law school, what happened? What happened to this group of friends?
Oh well, they scattered all around. Those from Richmond went back to Richmond. They'd rather go back to Richmond and starve than go to New York or Atlanta or someplace like that and make an awful lot of money. Well, a lot of them did both. I mean, went back to Richmond, made a lot of money. But you couldn't tell in those days. Those were the depths of the Depression. And I had a cousin who gave me a job in his small law firm in Baltimore. And I went up there and was there for a couple of years. Unfortunately, he wasn't. He was trying a case in Pittsburgh most of that time. And they paid me $75 a month, and were pretty sure I wasn't worth that, and I had to live on it. I had absolutely no other income. And I lived up in Baltimore, $75 a month for 2 years. And then I came back. I figured I could do better than that back here in Staunton, and did.
So now your father, though, had a law firm here, correct?
Yeah, he was a lawyer here, and I came back and went in with him.
Now, was he trying to get you to come back here?
No, he didn't try to persuade me at all. He wanted me to do whatever would be best for me. But that's the way it worked out, and of course it worked out just fine. I was back here for several years before the war started.
And then what happened? You entered the war. Was this something that you volunteered for, or?
Oh yeah, but I was not married, so of course I knew I'd be. I registered for the draft and knew that my number was very, very high. So unless we got into a war, well, I wouldn't be called. But as soon as Pearl Harbor hit, well, of course I knew everybody's going in, and my father had taken me to Washington and introduced me to some of the people in the Judge Advocate General's Corps, where he had served in World War I. And there were still some officers up there that remembered him. He had served in Washington, and then right after the war ended, they sent him over to Pershing's headquarters in Paris, and he was over there in France, and he was over there for 6 or 8 months before he got out. And it was a great experience for him, and he loved it. And so they suggested that I apply for a commission in the JAG Corps. When Pearl Harbor came, I went down to Norfolk with a friend of mine from Charlottesville to see what the Navy had. We had some friends down there from law school at the university who were in naval intelligence. And we went down and they said, we're looking for lawyers for naval intelligence, and we'll hire you and pay you as if you were a Lieutenant JG until your commission comes through. There's so many applications now, it'll take a while to work your commission through. And my friend decided he wasn't going to do it. He said, he'd been a great athlete at the university. He said, it's going to be interesting to me to find out what the Army thinks I can do. I'm going to let them decide. And did, and ended up as a crew chief for an aircraft squadron in England. Well, I wasn't willing to let them make that decision for me. So I went on down there to the Navy. In January, right after Pearl Harbor, I went down there and worked as a naval intelligence agent until my commission came through. Well, then they sent me to a Navy school up at Cornell and an intelligence school in Washington and then back down. And by that time, I realized that shore duty naval intelligence duty wasn't very inspiring. It was really, now they call it, I think, the Naval Investigative Service or something like that. And that would have been a more apt title in those days. We weren't doing anything in the intelligence service in Norfolk about ship movements or anything of that kind. We were checking on the loyalty of people applying for the job of janitors, naval base, that kind of thing. Well, we stayed busy all the time, and it was important work. Somebody had to do it, but a bunch of us decided that we didn't want to explain to our children later on, after the war and after we were married, when they asked where we were, we said, well, we were in the post office building in Norfolk throughout the war. So as soon as the Chief of Naval Operations sent an all-night through and saying commanding officers are no longer permitted to withhold requests for more active service. The day after that went in there, I took my letter and stood up all night on the train to Alexandria and got off and went to Bupers headquarters right up on the hill. And said, give me amphibious duty.
Why that duty?
'Cause I wanted to let them know I meant it. Nobody volunteered for that, thinking they were going to get another desk job. And so they said, well, I said, I think I'd like to be on an LST and maybe I'd be a navigator, but I better give me some more navigation. Said, all right, we'll send you to this school at Princeton. So they sent me up there. So there were 2 of us there out of 600 who weren't worried about our orders at all. The other was this friend of mine. He'd been an All-American football player at Southern California, and he had operated speedboats in Lake Arrowhead and so on. He'd married a daughter of a movie star, and so he knew he was going into PTs. And I was satisfied I was going into Atlantic amphibious forces, and so everybody else was worried. Orders came out at the end of 60 days. Lo and behold, I had orders along with everybody else except my friend. He got his PT orders. Along with everybody else, I got ordered to Dam Neck, Virginia, to go in the armed guard. Take a Navy gun crew on a merchant marine ship. I went to the commanding officer of the school, who was an Annapolis man. I said, look, I've worked awful hard to get back in the Navy, and I don't want to get out of it now. I don't want to be on a merchant marine ship fiddling around out there. I've asked for amphibious duty. I said, I'm not asking for anything easy. Can't you do something about this? And he said, well, yeah, I think maybe I can. And he called Washington and got me a change of orders by telephone, ordered me to the amphibious base and the landing craft school in San Diego. And so that's where I went. By that time, I guess maybe I was the student commanding officer of this brigade or something, so that maybe that helped get the change of orders. But anyway, the Navy was always good to me.
Yeah.
Anytime I asked for something that I thought wasn't asking for softer duty, the Navy always gave it to me.
And so eventually you got sent to the South Pacific.
Yeah, I was put in charge of a unit. Nobody has ever known exactly what it was supposed to do. It's called a landing craft unit, and there were about 300 men and about 20, 25 officers. And we operated these small landing craft. We were prepared to make landings out there in the South Pacific. But we were supposed to be in New Mir for a good while and then move up, I guess, as operations moved up. Well, we went out there. First, they sent us, the ship wasn't ready to take us out, so they sent us up to an Army post, Fort Ord, which was up north of Los Angeles. In fact, up on the Monterey Peninsula. And they put us in there for about 6 weeks. And we worked with the Army and had a really fine time. And I took a terrible risk. Without any authority at all, I gave everybody in that unit 2 weeks leave before we left the country. And I said, now, if any of you is 15 minutes late coming back, I said, I'll probably end up in a Navy prison. I had an officer who had worked for the railroads. He arranged the whole thing. He arranged a train for him and everything else to come east. One of them came so far east, he came up on the Canadian border in Maine. That's where he lived. Wow. Well, I looked after everybody except myself, and I hadn't made arrangements to get myself home. So I went up and caught a ride on a Navy plane. The fellow didn't know what he was doing. It brought us in and wrecked us in Atlanta. And he stayed there because they were going to have a naval inquiry about him. And I got home some other way. I went back out about 4 or 5 days earlier than the rest of my group to make certain everything would be ready. And when the day came, every single one of them was there. Every single one of them. One of my officers had gotten married, but every officer and every man was there when we called the roll at the end of that time. So I got by with it, but there's a terrible chance. I had no authority to do it at all.
Why did you take that chance?
Well, because I thought an awful lot of those men. They're just great. And they'd been working awful hard. They'd probably been in 6 months or so, and hadn't been home. It was the last chance they had. I figured we might be out for, well, I was out for 2 years. They were out for about a year. And so I just decided I'm just going to do it, that's all. I figured I could trust them, and I did. And they proved that they could be trusted.
Yeah. So what kind of action did you all see when you went out to the Pacific?
We didn't see any action. We had an island of our own. We ended up with an island of our own, that was awful good duty. And we operated all of the water transportation for this naval operation. There was a very fine airfield there, which they enlarged so they could take B-29s. But the war moved on so fast that it moved way beyond that area. But while we were there, we were pretty important in the functioning of that operation because there was a New Zealand radar post on Randover Island. There'd been the PT base where Kennedy had operated from when he had his escapade up in Kolombangara. And it was just a far-flung operation, Seabees had an encampment on another one of the islands, but it's right unusual to be king of all you survey. It was right good duty, and we controlled all of the small boats, and so we were in a right strong position.
So I guess you need to change. Okay. As soon as he finishes changing that, I'm going to ask you what happened after the war. Okay. Experiences. What happened after the war for you? After you established the base and
I left the Philippines on July 31st. I could pick the ship I wanted because I was in charge of operations there, and I picked a new transport, and I got on there with orders to go back for rest and recuperation or something like that, we figured then, when I left the Philippines, that the war would last until 1948. Well, I didn't know it, but the plans were already underway to invade the Japanese home islands November the 1st of 1945. Anyway, I expected to come back out there in about 6 months, probably. It probably never would have happened, but that's what I was anticipating. And our ship got about a third of the way back. I hoped to San Francisco, where I was going to see some of my old officers and men. And by golly, they dropped the 2 atomic bombs, and the war ended. And then they were having so much fun with peace parades and everything in San Francisco that they diverted our ship up to Seattle. Said they couldn't stand any more of it in San Francisco, any more Navy people coming in there. And by golly, we were diverted into Seattle and got in there in the middle of a Saturday night. And Seattle on a Saturday night and a Sunday morning is an awful dead place, which wasn't what I was anticipating at all after being out for 23 months.
Yeah.
But I caught, after a day or two, I caught a Navy plane down to San Francisco. And then when I got back home, I had 30 days leave. And but I went up to Bureau of Naval Personnel to find out what assignment I would have now that everything was changed, it was different. I said, I declined to do any legal work while the war was going on, but I said, it's over now, and I'd like to do some legal work, get back in, because I still had to go several months before I could get out. So I would like to have some legal work during my last few months, now that the war's over. And they said, all right. And so I went on up to New York and had a little recreation up there. I got back into my horror. They had ordered me to go to an auxiliary airfield outside of Pensacola and relieve a legal officer who I was sure had been there all the time I'd been out there on the equator, that he's probably down there enjoying himself in the officers club in Pensacola. And I hopped on the C&O train and rushed back up there to Alexandria and went right up to Beauport and said, I can't accept this. You can't do this to me. I just know you send me down there to take over from a fellow who's just been enjoying himself for the last 3 years. And they said, well, we can't do a thing in the world about it. I said, let me have a list of your officers over at the main Navy building on Constitution Avenue. And they said, All right, here's the list, and we'll give you 3 hours. See what you can do. If you can't do something in 3 hours, I ought to stand. I took that list and I hopped in a taxi and I rushed over to the main Navy, and I looked at the list, and there was a classmate of mine from law school. And I knew if he was still on active duty, he'd be up there very close to Admiral King, who was a CNO. I asked the guard, I said, is Lieutenant Commander Root still on duty? Oh, yes, he said, right up on the 3rd deck. I knew exactly where he was, right up there next to Admiral King. I hopped up the steps, and as I went up the last flight, I ran into this admiral and almost knocked him on the floor. It was Admiral King. And sure enough, by God, my friend was in the office next to him. And I went in and I said, now, Oren, you can get things done, and this is one thing you got to get done. You got to save me from going down to an auxiliary airfield at Pensacola. And he said, well, I'll see what I can do. And he got on the telephone and he got me a change of orders to the Office of General Counsel for the Navy. And that was just one of the finest jobs that anybody could have. And so, there once more, I got a change of orders by the telephone. So I went up there and I spent my last 4 months. I got promoted, and it's all automatic, you know, it wasn't all merit. But I had a mighty fine time the last 4 or 5 months.
And so you were there for 4 or 5 months, and...
Then I came on back down and started practicing law.
Oh, so when did you meet your wife?
Well, that was the following year after I got back. Let's see, in January of 1946. I think the Navy still paid me for another couple of months. I had accumulated leave that I'd never used and all that kind of thing. But the following year, I met her. And I met her in my own home up there on Church Street. And it was just one of those 1,000,000-to-1 shots. There she goes. She'd been on a house party up in Warrenton with a group of friends from Princeton, including a gentleman to whom she was engaged, became engaged. And I didn't know anything about that. But I saw her and I said, well, now, this is it. She didn't know anything about that, didn't say anything about it. And this is probably the most foolish thing I ever did. I went to about 2 weeks after that, I went to the Victory reunion at UVA. Ran into some of my old friends over there and had drinks with a number of them. And they said, well, you never ever gotten married, have you? I said, no, but I've met the girl I'm going to marry. And then, of all dumb things, I said who it was, and they knew who she was. Well, the upshot of it was that I wrote her and said I'd like to come down to Southwest Virginia and meet some of the Stuart relatives from down there, and it took her about a month to work out a time when she was available. And then I went down there in July, and the first time we were alone, we got engaged. And I'll tell you, probably the most impulsive thing I ever did, and the best thing I ever did in my life. That really happened that way.
So she was not really seriously engaged to the other man.
She'd only known him 6 years. Only all during the war, she used to go up to Princeton to see him and that kind of thing, you know. And she'd known him and was very fond of him. But and finally, she figured she never was going to be any fonder than that, and that's the way it worked. Well, she found out it wasn't that exactly the way. Of course, it wrecked him. He became president of a railroad, one of the biggest in America. So it didn't blight him either.
Well, it sounds like she got the better deal.
I'll tell you, but that really is, that's the greatest accomplishment of my life.
Well, now, after you all got married and you were practicing law, what happened after that? It sounds like you weren't too satisfied just with practicing law.
Well, I like practicing law, but just before I met her, this lady around Staunton, who was really a remarkable lady, she was responsible for establishing the Woodrow Wilson birthplace as a national shrine, working with people in Washington and so on. And she was once voted the most distinguished lady in Virginia.
Who was this?
Her name was Emily Pancake Smith.
Okay.
And she was a most remarkable. She was on the Board of Visitors at UVA. She never went to college, but she was on there and a very valuable board member because she had tremendous imagination and a remarkable ability to get people to do things they didn't want to do. And she was really a near genius at that. And anyway, she decided that I ought to go to the legislature. She didn't consult me about that. She got a couple of friends of mine to circulate a petition for me. I didn't know what the petition was for, and when it came in, I didn't know what position they were petitioning me to run for. And it turned out it was the House of Delegates. And so I ran and was unopposed. So she was responsible for my doing that, and I had been elected, or at least I was. The primary was over, and no one had run against me when I met her. So I was going to Richmond, but I had never been to the legislature when we met. And her father had been in; he was state senator and had been for some years at that time.
Now, you entered the legislature at an interesting time period in Virginia's history.
Well, that's right.
A lot of changes were occurring. I was wondering what your involvement was in some of these changes.
Well, there were a number of us who had served in the armed services who went down there, and we thought that some concessions ought to have been made in that we'd all been in a successful war together, and the idea of continuing with the poll tax and the Jim Crow laws was an unnecessary insult. And we sponsored legislation to eliminate those things, but they never got out of committee. All the committees down there were very carefully stacked, and so there'd be some publicity over it, introduction of some of these bills, but they never saw the light of day. They never let them out of committee. We felt it was very unwise to suppress that feeling. That there was enough feeling then to have some cooperation, and that it would have had a very helpful influence and effect. But we never know. We'll know whether it would have or wouldn't have, because they never let it come out.
Did you ever get any negative feedback from your sponsorship or co-sponsorship of this legislation?
No. And I would say when I was finally defeated for re-election to the Senate after I had gotten in there, I got in there unopposed. I didn't get the black vote. I was. It cost me a lot of influence in Richmond, but it didn't help me. It didn't help me back home.
Mm-hmm. Did people know that what you tried to support?
Yeah. Oh yeah, it was in the Richmond newspapers.
Yeah, interesting. But it didn't have any positive impact on this election. So after you left the Senate, this was about in 1967.
Well, I was in there just for 2 years. The redistricting plan was attacked in court and thrown out, so they had to have a special election to the Senate for a 2-year term. 66 to 68, that's right. And so I went to the sitting senator and said, I'm going to run. I've decided I'm going to run. And so after he thought about it a while, he decided he would not run. He would retire. He never told me that, but that's what happened. He found out he couldn't win. Well, anyway, so I was unopposed. I went in unopposed. And then the next year, the Republicans were taken by surprise. The next year, they'd had time to organize, and they got this rich man from Waynesboro to Dawson to run. His wife had just died, and he was lonesome, and he had plenty of money, and his business was going all right. And so he ran against me, and we were on television from time to time, and there was no issue. He took no issue with me on education or anything of that sort. But the only thing was, he said that he was. He said his wife had just died. He'd say this on television, and that.
So you went for the sympathy vote.
That's right, and he got it.
Now while you were in the House, you were one of the Young Turks. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's those of us. They were all veterans. I was not as aggressive on some issues as some of the others. For instance, Armstead Booth, who was an old friend of mine from college days. He was a Rhodes Scholar most of the time when I was in the undergraduate school. But anyway, we were real long-term friends, and he was the most aggressive of the so-called young Turks, and a lot of us were a good deal more conservative than Armstead. We thought he was going too far too soon. And I think that's right. He was a generation ahead of his time, a very able man, just as smart as he could be. And nowadays, he'd be a recognized, accepted leader. but he was just a little ahead of his time. And so I don't know whether we accounted for anything much or not, but one thing it did, it kept us from having any influence on what was going on down there, because they had in the House, for instance, and the same way in the Senate, they had the committees stacked. Now, I'd gotten on good committees the very first time I went down there before they knew that I might not go along with 100%. And so they wouldn't change the committees, and I ended up as chairman of the House Courts of Justice Committee my last year there. But it wasn't until Governor Armand changed his position on massive resistance that they opened up the broom closets, and a bunch of us came out that had been suppressed. And so we were in a position then to help carry that fight to eliminate massive resistance, at least officially, in the state, and we got it done. So in that's really probably about the only place where we really made a positive gain. We accomplished that. But it wouldn't have been done if there hadn't been some old line conservatives who saw the light of day. Para, for instance, he had been an organization stalwart, but I think his father had been superintendent of schools maybe over in Lynchburg, and he just could not, in good conscience, go along with shutting schools down or keeping them shut down. And there were several others like that. Taylor Murphy Sr., for instance, had been treasurer of Virginia when Colgate Dodden was governor. And just a wonderful man, but very, very conservative. Well, he prayed over this, and I know he talked to Dabney Lancaster, Dr. Dabney Lancaster, and he went along with breaking it up. Well, it was a terrible. I was talking to his son not long about that, about his father, how I admired the way that he had stood fast at a time when it was very difficult for him to do it. He said, yes, he said he lost a good many lifelong friends that he never recovered. Well, that's what happened. But there was enough of them like that, by God, like Para and Taylor Murphy and some others, to get it through by one vote.
So it costs people a lot.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
What did it cost you anything when you took your stance?
Well, yeah, I think so. I think that it might very well have cost me re-election to the Senate. I don't know. It might have. But of course, that by that time, Mills Godwin and I, and Harry Byrd Jr. and Albertis Harrison and a bunch of others all went to the legislature for the first time the same day, 1948. And Mills Godwin, of course, became a leader down there, a conservative leader, and he led the massive resistance movement. And they lost by the one vote on the final go-around, but Albertis Harrison was he didn't vote on it because he was the Attorney General, and he was taking the Virginia cases and losing every single one of them in the federal courts. And he told me later, he said, it's the most unfortunate position in the world to be in, for a lawyer to be in, knowing you're going to lose every time you go take a case to court. Well, so anyway, he was the next governor, and then was followed by Mills, who had really been the leader of the massive resistance movement. Well, in his inauguration address, Godwin outlined his program, and to my absolute astonishment, he was proposing the community college system to be financed by a state sales tax. I went to him afterwards and I said, Mills, I said, we've been on opposite sides of different things and all, but I said, you've got a program that I would like to help you put through. And I did, and I was one of the sponsors on the community college program. As a result of that, Godwin appointed me to head up several different things. And he came up here personally and spoke for me for my reelection. Well, and then he put me on the court. So that's a right remarkable thing for people in the position that he was in and I was in, for him to do that, and I think it took a big man to do it. Well, I had been president of the Virginia Bar Association in 1966, and Godwin had indicated that he would be inclined to select a member of the Supreme Court from a list recommended by the Virginia Bar Association. Well, the first person he put on was Albertis Harrison, who was endorsed by the Virginia Bar Association. All right, then Chief Justice Eggleston and Justice Buchanan retired the same day, announced their retirement the same day. And the Bar Association then took a major effort, and they came in with 6 names to submit to the governor, from which they asked him to select 2. And I was on that list. So at least I made the cut.
Did you know you were going to be on the list?
Yes. Yes, I did. A former president of the association had gotten up from a sick bed where he had pneumonia and led the campaign for me in the State Bar Association. And yes, I knew. And so I'm sure there was a hard decision for him to make, but any decision like that is. But he made it, and I've always been very grateful to him, and I've told him so.
Did he ever tell you exactly why he selected you?
No. And as it turned out, our closest friends on the court were the Albertis Harrisons. Now, he and I had gone to the legislature at the same time, but we had never been close down there at all. And when he was governor, we were not close, on friendly terms, but not close. But he became my closest friend on the court. We traveled together all over the world. And as a matter of fact, when he died, his family asked that Mills Godwin and I speak, which we did. We're the only people who did.
So what happened that got the 2 of you so close together once on the court?
Well, we just, I don't know, we had both been small-town lawyers, and we appreciated the problems you have in the profession that way, and we were just, we didn't always agree on things, but we just had the highest regard for each other. he was a marvelous man, and a very bright man. He was an excellent lawyer, and well, we just and our wives were very close, and so it was just a magnificent opportunity for us to know people real well that we never had before. And he often expressed great regret that we hadn't been closer when he was governor. But anyway, that's the way those things go. And speaking of the Virginia Bar Association, I was present when they made the only trip they've ever made to meet with English lawyers and judges. In 1966, we went over there, and I had some English connections. And we spent a week in London and met with the members of the Bar Society for the barristers and the Law Society for the solicitors, and had just had a magnificent time. And they've never gone back. And about 5 years later, I've forgotten who's president, called me and said, well, that had been such a wonderful success that they were going to organize a trip to Scotland. And could I make arrangements for them to meet with some of the Scottish lawyers and judges? Well, I said, well, I'll see what I can do. So I got in touch with Lord Denning, and he in turn put me in touch with the Chief Judge of Scotland, Lord Emsley. And so Albertis Harrison and Lee and I, and the Harrisons and the Cochrans, went up to Edinburgh and called on Lord Emsley. Well, he was a wonderful fellow, and we told him that we would like to have a meeting of Virginia lawyers and judges with Scottish lawyers and judges, and could he help us with it? And he said he certainly could and would. And they went ahead and set it up, and Emsley, he told me, he said, we're going to let you have a reception in the Parliament House. And he said, that's never been done by anybody outside of Scotland with one exception, the Queen. That's the only person outside of Scotland who's ever been permitted to have a reception in the Parliament House, but the Virginia Bar Association is going to be permitted to do that, which they were. Well, the trouble about it was, you can't keep lawyers together. They went over there and we made arrangements for them to have a meal at the University of Edinburgh. And by God, half of them never showed up. It was the most embarrassing thing in the world. They'd gone to an awful lot of trouble, and so the Bar Association later on had to go and send them a check for, say, $1,000 or something for the people that hadn't showed up. So they've never done it again and never will again. But so I was responsible for the 2 times when the Virginia Bar Association met in the UK.
Yeah.
And one time it was a tremendous success, and it was a big success up there. In fact, that we had that reception in the Parliament House, and they don't have very many lawyers and judges in Scotland. And I made the mistake of telling Emsley the first time up, or asking him whether or not he'd gone through one of the Inns of Court down in London. Well, he said, no, anybody can do that. He said, it takes 7 years to become a lawyer in Scotland. And it does. But you can do it in 18 months down in England, if you know the way to do it. But they're very proud of their legal system up there in Scotland. And I don't believe they've got over 100 barristers in Scotland.
I didn't realize that.
Most of them are solicitors, and the few that are there do practically all the appellate work. Well, not only was Emsley a marvelous man, but he was a scratch golfer. He'd play in these tournaments against judges and lawyers down in England, beat them every time. He was a marvelous golfer. And sometimes when we'd go there, we went on to Scotland several times with friends on golfing trips, and sometimes they'd say, well, we can't get on this course or that course. And I said, well, now, I believe I can help that. I'd get in touch with him, say, by God, and he'd get us on there. And I'd leave a bottle of whiskey in his locker. And fortunately, he was always on the bench, and so he couldn't play. I was so glad he couldn't, because he was a pro, a marvelous man.
So you had some very, very interesting trips. And I kind of wanted to get back to your experiences with the Virginia Supreme Court. When you were appointed to the court, and there were only a handful of you who had not sat on the bench before. Tell me about how the other justices who were already there felt about those of you who didn't have some of the experiences they had.
Well, I expect they were used to it by then, because there were two of them. There were two of them on there that had not been judges before. One of them was Harrison, and the other one was Tommy Gordon, whom Harrison appointed. So when I went on, that meant 3 out of 7 had come just from the practice of law. And I think they felt as we did, that it's a good idea to have. It's always a good idea to have, say, one person on there who hadn't come up through the ranks of the judiciary.
Why? Why is that?
Well, they're closer to the practice of bar, and they know the problems that lawyers have, and I have to be a little gentler with them on technicalities, I think. Anyway, I never saw any difficulty about that at all.
So how did when you first got on the court, did you find that you had to learn a lot of new things, a lot of approaches or techniques, or was this much like your practice of law, your general knowledge?
Well, no, I found it was quite difficult to write an opinion. I had written opinions as a lawyer and so on, but that's where you're trying to convince somebody of your view. Well, it's different when you're laying the law down for the legal profession. And I had some difficulty with the first opinions that I had, and I was afraid I was inclined to make them too long. And so I got Gordon, whom I'd known ever since university days, and he was considered quite a draftsman. And when he left the court, he went back to McGuire Woods to instruct the young associates about draftsmanship, drafting papers, documents. And so the first set of opinions I wrote, I had him review them before I put them in final form and sent them to other members of the court. And that worked fine. And then it very soon got to the point where I wasn't sure I agreed with Gordon on his reasoning on some things, and so I stopped sending them to him, and this only lasted probably 1 or 2 terms of court. After that, I just took my own chances.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Stop just for a moment.
Sure.
Did you need anything
No.
to drink?
All right, we are back on record.
Okay, tell me about a little bit more about the difficulty in trying to write an opinion versus a brief, and what you would do? Because I know you like to sit down and write your opinions with a pen.
Well, of course, I always had a law clerk, too, and all of my law clerks, except the last one, I got from the University of Virginia, the law school, and generally speaking, they were quite good. Naturally, some were better than others, but I would say that with maybe one or two exceptions, they were just fine, and some of them have gone on and done real well as lawyers. One is head of litigation for Troutman Sanders, I guess it is, and others, a couple of them have gotten minor judgeships, like General District Court. One wrote me the other day that he's going to take that job. There's one around here who was recently made juvenile and domestic relations court judge. God, what a terrible job that is. Ooh. But anyway, I'd have my law clerk, of course, read all of the record and the briefs and so forth, and make a memo on it, and we'd talk about it. And I always wrote the opinions. That isn't always the case. We've had members of that court that did very little writing of opinions. Law clerks, I know of one law clerk that wrote opinions, and there was one law professor at the University of Virginia who, by a predecessor member of the court, was paid $100 an opinion.
Really? Was this a prominent member of the court?
A former member, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, he's dead now.
Mm-hmm.
He couldn't write opinions.
You don't want to tell us who that was.
No, I won't do that. Well, I'll tell you about another one. There's one from over in Orange, a very gentlemanly fellow named Browning, a great ladies' man, very fine-looking man, and he went to Florida every winter, and he'd go as soon as court was over for the winter session. He'd take off for Florida, and he was assigned this case, and he just didn't have time to get it done, so he turned to Justice Whittle and Whittle said, "All right, I'll write the opinion for you, and you go on down to Florida, and I'll get it for you." So Whittle wrote the opinion, and Judge Browning came back and read it and said, "No, I don't like that at all," and he dissented. And Justice Whittle said, "I'm never going to offer to write an opinion for you again when you can't decide which way you want to go."
Well, who were some of the law clerks that you had? They were all UVA.
The last one I had was from Washington Lee, and she was a girl, and she was just as bright as she could be. She was married to a young man who got a job here in the local bank as trust officer, and they stayed here for about 10 years maybe, and they were very active in music circles. They sang in the chorus, the local chorus, and were very active that way.
What was her name? Do you remember?
Well, they divorced now.
Oh, okay.
They moved down he got a job down in South Carolina. They moved down to South Carolina and had several children. And I got a letter from her asking me to recommend her to take South Carolina bar, which she did and passed it, and is in a firm down there in Columbia, I think now. But I'm afraid she and her husband are divorced. That's too bad, because she's a very bright girl, and I'm sure she's making a success of the practice of law down there. She was quite good. And the reason I had her because I knew I was going to retire and on my 75th birthday. And so it ran a year and a half or something like that. And she was, under the circumstances, she was willing to stay as long as it was necessary. And so...
Who were some of the other law clerks that you had?
Well, one of the second law clerk I had is practicing law here in Staunton. His name is John Sills, very able fellow, and he, strangely enough, he decided that he did not want to do court work, and he does not do court work, but he is he's considered, well, you know, these lists of experts in this and that. He's listed as one in business law or something of the sort. He's a first-class lawyer. And I think he's the attorney for, say, Mary Baldwin College and for a lot of activities where I used to be the lawyer. And he's a first-class lawyer. John Burke was one of my early law clerks, and he's now head of litigation, I think, at least for the Richmond, Virginia offices of Tradman Sanders, which is an Atlanta firm. It used to be Mays Valentine in Richmond. Fine firm. Let's see. I've got a...
What were some of the things you looked for? And what were some of the things that you looked for in a law clerk when you were interviewing them, or?
Well, I'd get them. I'd get one of the professors over at the university to line me up a group to interview, and then I'd go over there. But they had to live here for a year, and a lot of them didn't want to do that. Didn't want to live in a small town for a year. So, and a lot of them want to be law clerks for a federal judge. That's the glamour field now. Of course, every now and then somebody from over there will get on a clerkship with the Supreme Court of the U.S., but very few get that far. But a lot of them will get clerkships with the Fourth Circuit or district court judge, and they prefer the federal system, and that's understandable. That's the glamour area now.
Mm-hmm. So you did most of your clerks stay about a year or 2 years, or?
I would only hire them for 1 year.
Okay.
Now I know my friend Stevenson, for instance. He just hates to interview for clerkships, and so he gets one. He'll keep until they die. If he's had a girl he's had for 15 years, I think. Really? Lives over in Roanoke and comes over to Covington, Hot Springs, where he is. I don't think that's right. I don't think it's. I made up my mind in the very beginning I'd hire him for 1 year. It wasn't fair to the clerk to ask them to stay longer than that. They ought to go on out and start practicing law. They've gotten the maximum they can get out of it in 1 year, and I don't think it's fair to hold them over. But most of them will hold them over. And
so where did you write most of your opinions? Were you home? Were you in your office?
Office. I had an office downtown here. I wrote them practically all here.
Mm-hmm. And then how did they get sent to Richmond?
Well, we'd just circulate them by mail, but we'd circulate them ahead of the opinion conference, and then one day in between sessions, we'd go down and have an opinion conference and go over all the draft opinions. But we'd send them ahead by mail. But now they send them all by computer.
Right. Yeah.
I had the oldest secretary, and by God, she she learned how to handle sending that stuff around by computer better than any of them, and they'd have her come down to Richmond and teach these young ones how to do it.
That's cute. Well, I was wondering now, the court had a long tradition of having very few dissenting opinions for quite some time. But that started to change, and I was wondering what your perspective was, being on the court.
Well, I heard people in the legislature, I remember a lawyer over there who was a very able fellow said he thought that there ought to be more dissents from the Virginia court. And I said, well, I think the U.S. Supreme Court has entirely too much dissenting going on. I said, you never know where you stand there, where you have these 5-4 decisions, where the switch of one vote, by golly, and the law is entirely different. I said, I think it, and on a lot of important cases, Virginia constitutional cases, we made every effort to have a unanimous court. We felt like when we were speaking on matters of that importance, the court ought to speak with one voice so that there wouldn't be any misunderstanding about what the law meant in that respect. And we did that in a number of cases. Now, I didn't hesitate to, I dissented any time I felt like it. I wrote over 400 majority opinions, and I think I probably wrote 50 minority opinions, dissenting opinions, or occasionally a concurring opinion. So I mixed it up some, but most of them are unanimous. Oh, they were in my time. I haven't read an opinion from the court since I retired. They've changed all the law maybe since I left.
Well, now, with all those decisions, are there any particular cases that stick out in your mind that really required some maneuvering to get a majority opinion or almost a unanimous opinion?
Well, I don't know how much maneuvering, but I know that sometimes if we'd have a case involving, say, the Virginia Constitution, or something, say, involving state taxation, something of that kind, the Chief Justice might say at the beginning of the conference, all right, now we're going to take up this next case and talk about it. And he said, I think if possible, we ought to reach a unanimous agreement on how this case goes, regardless of which way it goes, because it's too important to have a 4-3 decision or something of that kind. And so he said, of course, anybody will do what they think they ought to do, but I hope that we can come to a unanimous agreement on the final opinion. And invariably it did. Maybe not always, but almost always it did. Now, I don't know whether they're doing much dissenting over there now or not. I just don't follow it.
Mm-hmm. I heard that they're doing much more now.
You think they are doing?
I've heard that they are, and I read a few things that suggest they're doing much more dissenting now. But it sounds like you were at the forefront of a lot of lobbying to get the justices to agree about a certain opinion. Is that correct?
Well, they would. The Chief Justice would take that position on these matters involving constitutional law, Virginia constitutional law. Now, on federal constitutional law, of course, it'd be helpful to have a unanimous opinion, but not as vital as when you're dealing with the state constitution.
Was there ever a case that came before you that you had difficulty with because the law said one thing, but your personal views on it were different?
Yes. In fact, I remember writing a case, and I believe it involved a construction contract at VMI, and a defect. They found a defect, but statute of limitations barred recovery. And I said I thought that was in the opinion, that I thought it was very unfortunate, but that we were bound by what the law stated, and it was up to the legislature to change the law if it had an unfair result, and that this appeared to be one of those. I made it pretty strong that I invited the legislature to correct this feature of the law.
Did they take you
They
up
never,
on it?
they never did. They never did. And I made it just right in the opinion, invited them to go and do something about it.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as I know, they never did while I was still on the court.
Were there any other cases where you felt that the law should have been different, but you had to rule for the law?
I'm sure there were, because that was always, I think when I went on the court, a lot of these newspaper people thought that I was probably going to be a wild liberal. Well, I made it very plain. I said, now, where the law is concerned, I said, I've had enough experience in the legislative branch so that now that I'm in the judicial branch, I think I have an understanding of the difference between the branches and the difference in the assignments and the duties of the branches. And as far as I'm concerned, the duty of the judicial branch is not to make law at all. It's to interpret the law that's been made by the legislative branch, and that's the way that I will handle myself on the court, which I think was probably a disappointment to a good many people. But I felt that way all along. I made no secret of it. I always felt that way about it.
Mm-hmm. Were there times when the decisions perhaps were unfortunate as far as you were concerned because of the law, aside from the case that you talked about with the construction company?
Yes, I think there've been cases there where I think the statute of limitations had to be imposed when it resulted in an unfair result.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, who is you had a long-time secretary. Who was that individual, and how long had she been with you?
Well, she died shortly after I retired. She had been with me, she had not been with me, I'm not sure she'd been with me at all when I was practicing law. We had several secretaries there, but I don't think any of them were interested in having to go to Richmond from time to time and so on. And so I believe I got her. She had been secretary for an active lawyer, and something happened to him. He got into difficulty, but I knew that she was a very fine legal secretary, and she was. And so she was with me just the entire time I was active on the court.
What was her name?
Her name was Mary Lightner, Mary Hassett Lightner. She was a native, and her brother, Tom Hassett, had been a lifelong friend of mine, and he was mayor of Staunton back here about 30 years ago, I guess. He was in the textile industry, and he got an offer to run a bunch of mills down in South Carolina, I think, and resigned as mayor and left, and died down there some years ago. In other words, they were local people, and we'd all known each other. And she was a fine person.
So what were some of the things that she did particularly that helped you as the justice? Aside from, typing up your notes and so forth, were there some things in particular that you really depended on from her?
Well, sure. She kept up with the correspondence, and she went by the post office every day and picked up our mail and saw to it that I paid bills on time. kept me organized.
Well, now, during your time on the court, did you notice any changes over the years from the very first year you were on the court till right before you retired? Were there any change? I mean, I know there were some people who changed on the court.
Well, let's see. I don't believe any women had come on the court by the time I retired. John Charles Thomas was the first black, and Rob put him on. His wife worked over in Rob's office, the governor's office. She's an awful nice person, and so he put John Charles on, and John Charles was quite an able man, but he couldn't live within his means, and he eventually got off the court, claiming it was health, to go back to Hunting Williams, where he'd have to, he would wreck his health a lot quicker than the court would, because he couldn't get by on the salary, $100,000 salary. They paid his bills over there and took him back. Mm-hmm. He's probably regretted it ever since, but because I guess he'd have been Chief Justice if he'd stayed. Mm-hmm. But I did not serve with the present Chief Justice. He was put on, I believe, after I left, but for another 13 years, I continued to sit on a panel of 3 or 4 members of the court hearing petitions for appeal to see whether or not to let them come on for argument before the full court. And they work that system, and it saves everybody an awful lot of time and trouble. And while I was doing that, 2 of the women came on the court, Barbara Keenan and Gray. And also Leroy came on there while I was still sitting on these panels. He came straight from McGuire Woods. So he's the last one on there that has not had prior judicial service. But I knew them all very pleasantly, and I did not sit on a panel with him. The panel I sat on was with Carrico and Barbara Keenan, and sometimes the fellow from Salem, not AG, but the other one. Used to be head of the intermediate appellate court. Thompson, is that it? I've forgotten.
When you were on the court, did you all socialize quite a bit? I know you talked about you and Harrison socializing, but did typically you all socialize quite a bit?
Well, it was customary. It had been before I went on the court for the court family, the court members and their wives, to get together for dinner Sunday night before the court session started the next day. And we would do that, and it was very pleasant. In those days, most of the justices lived outside of Richmond. And now practically all of them live in, well, most of them seem to live in Richmond. Or a lot of them do. And now they have no social life at all. But I remember we would do it. One time we all went out to John Charles Thomas's one Sunday night. I remember his mother was out there, a remarkable woman. And those were, I think those social affairs were very important. And I think it's a shame that they've discontinued all that. They have no social contact with one another at all anymore. I guess they have lunch. I guess they have lunch together. We used to go down, get a nasty lunch down there at the bank, foot of the hill.
You said a nasty lunch.
Yeah.
Not a good place to eat?
Not much. But I do think I've heard that there's really no social contact. They don't meet together for dinner or anything like that before or during the sessions.
So you think that having that social interaction really helped when you all were talking about the cases?
Well, I think it. I think it does, because I think it. Then you're dealing with social friends or equals when you're talking business, and I think you can trust each other more if you've seen them outside of court. And I think they miss a good deal by not doing that.
Mm-hmm. Now there's a justice who came on after you, Justice Poff, and there was some controversy about him because Nixon wanted to appoint him to one of the federal courts, but he had a rather anti-integration stance, and I was wondering, did that change the court dynamics at all when he was appointed?
No, not. I don't think at all. The court that Nixon wanted to appoint him to was the U.S. Supreme Court, and he could have gotten him on there, I think. Poff was a right influential lawyer up there in Congress. He had an awful lot to do with revising the federal legal code. He's quite an able man and a prodigious worker. But that columnist up there, who now dead, famous at one time, started taking after, threatening to reveal some things about Poff, worried him to death, and I believe he told Nixon he didn't want it. He didn't want to have him. He wasn't going to put his family up against anything like that. I think he could have had the appointment. He told Nixon, "I'm not interested in it. I won't take it."
Interesting. Well, I was wondering if you had any favorite stories that you would like to tell us before we conclude about your experiences on the bench, whether it's a favorite story with one of your fellow justices or with one of your clerks, or anything that you remember that you smile about. I wish I could think of one. I'm afraid I can't come up with one. What?
Hello.
It's my husband. My husband is out there. Well, let me just ask you, one of your mentors, was there anything that someone who was either your law professor or a good friend of yours who you saw as a mentor, Do you have a favorite story about one of them? I know this is a difficult question to ask out of the blue, but I was wondering if you had any little favorite stories.
Well, I remember Hardy Dillard, who was law professor when I was in law school, and later on became dean of the law school over at the university. And when he was dean of the law school, he was put on the Constitutional Revision Commission in 1969. Godwin appointed him to that commission, and he appointed me to the commission. He appointed Albertis Harrison as chairman of that commission, and it really was the most distinguished group of people that I've ever been associated with. Lewis Powell was on there, and he was a longtime friend of mine. And one time, I was riding, I think I was driving Hardy Dillard from Charlottesville down to Richmond where we were going to meet, and I told him about, we were going through the countryside or something. I saw some cows standing over there near a power line, and I said, Hardy, that reminds me, I was attorney for the power company but when I was practicing law, and just before I quit, I had a case involving a landowner down at Fishersville who was complaining about the location of the power line. He claimed that it had ruined his bull. And Hardy said, well, how could the power line ruin his bull? Well, I said he claimed it made him a cow. And Hardy said, well, that's the most remarkable threat I ever heard, to threaten the power company with suing for ruining the fellow's bull. And he said, that's the finest story I've ever heard. I think he probably took that with him to the Court of Justice over in The Hague. Shortly after that, he was appointed to that court, went over there. I used to tease him about that. They never did anything except argue. I don't think they ever handed down an opinion. It would take them 6 or 8 years, and then it didn't mean anything because nobody had to obey it. But he said it was a great experience that they could talk so much about anything in the world, and did. But I'm sure he told them the story about the cowardly bull who was ruined by the power line. God.
Well, that has got to be a case that should be written up in the books. Well, thank you so much for giving us all of your time today. I really enjoyed the wonderful stories.
I'll tell you one more story, and this was not while I was on the court. When I was in the legislature, I was head of the Virginia Commission, Woodrow Wilson Centennial Commission, because Woodrow Wilson was born here and lived here for a few minutes, a couple of years, I guess. But anyway, I was chairman of that commission, and the state made some money available, and we had various programs during the centennial year, which was 1956. And we carried on and had seminars and the usual thing. Even had a playwright write a play for us, which we put on. And this lady, this Emily Pancake Smith, of course, was instrumental in getting the commission formed and a national commission and all that. So we'd finished up our year, and we still had a little money left, which is very unusual. Emily Smith said, of course, we can't turn that money back in. She said the thing to do is for us to have a plaque prepared to present on behalf of the people of Virginia to the people of France in honor of Woodrow Wilson. He saved France in World War I. So we went down and we got a metal crafter down in Richmond to come up with this plaque. And the question was, the language to put on it. And I asked the head of the French department at Mary Baldwin, and they couldn't come up with the right answer. And so one day I was down in Richmond, and I picked up a phone and called my friend George Gibson, who was a brilliant fellow, one of the top partners over at Hunt and Williams. And I said, George, we're going to put this plaque up over in France. That's the idea. And the question is a suitable inscription on it. Would you mind thinking about it and writing me out something and sending it to me? Oh, he said, I'd be delighted. He said, hold on a minute. And I held on a minute, and then he said, this is what it ought to be. And he dictated to me over the phone. It was perfect. And we put it on the plaque, and we went over there, and we had not been to Paris before. Lee and I had not been there. But they had, in those days, the State Chamber of Commerce would sponsor trips to Europe, and they'd get somebody like ex-Governor Battle to head it up. And this time they went to the World's Fair in Brussels and then came down to Paris for these exercises that we were going to put on. Well, we got into Paris and we stayed at the Crillon Hotel, which was the most expensive hotel there, but that's where Woodrow Wilson had stayed when he had come over to Paris. So we felt like we had to stay there. And it was handsome, no question about that. Next morning at 8 o'clock, the knock on the door, opened it up, and two young men in striped pants came in. They were from the embassy right across the street. They said, Mr. Cochran, we've got terrible news for you. I said, well, what now? I said, they've lost all of our invitations that we sent over here to the American colony. What now? He said, we've got a new ambassador. He's only been here 2 weeks. And someone on the American side must speak at this ceremony in French, or the French will have their feelings hurt. The ambassador does not feel that he's up to it. What can you do about that? I said, look, I haven't had any French for 20 years, 25 years. I had some in college and school before that. I said, I'll tell you what, I do have this advantage over the ambassador. I can get out of town right after I make my remarks, and he can't. So you get me a secretary over there at the embassy to work on my speech and get me the right inflections, and I will do it. I said, it's ruining my time in Paris because my wife's going sightseeing, all the Virginia group going sightseeing, but I'll come over there. Well, I went over there, and I've always been a great admirer of the appearance of French women. If they're not real good looking, they're very stylish looking and everything. Well, I got the exception to the rule. She wasn't good looking and she wasn't stylish looking, but she was a good secretary. And she worked with me for 2.5 days, and finally she said, I think you can get by now. And so I thanked her, went back, went to bed that night, woke up the next day for the big occasion, knock on the door at 8 o'clock, these same two gentlemen in the striped pants said, Mr. Cochran, we've got wonderful news. The ambassador's been taking extra private lessons. He feels now that he can give his remarks in French. I said, go back and congratulate Ambassador Houghton and tell him he can give his remarks in Sanskrit if he desires. I'm giving mine in French. And I did. And the end of the story is they had a whole group of the American colony and a Scottish colonel of the Argyle Southern Highlanders in full kilt, 6'4", wonderful looking man. Became a general later on. And everybody just had a great time. And this little girl came up to me afterwards and she said, Mr. Cochran, I'm from Alabama. And she said, I've been in Paris for 4 years, and yours is the first French I've understood. Gives you an idea how slow it was. that really happened.
Oh, that's wonderful.
So next time you go to Paris, go by the Palais de Chaillot, and there's a plaque up there. Woodrow Wilson. It's at the end of the Avenue of Woodrow Wilson. It's not a very big plaque, but I'll tell you, that got the last dollar from the Woodrow Wilson Centennial. And it took us 2 years to get it done. It was 2 years after the Centennial because the French couldn't decide where they wanted to have us located.
I will make sure I go there the next time I go to
Palais de
Paris.
Chaillot, beautiful location.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful story. I can't imagine doing all that cramming and then someone suddenly tell you, that's it.
That's right, that's right. God. Oh.
This was wonderful. Thank you
You see,
so
I have no
much.
imagination. All my stories are true.
Well,
they really
no,
are. 'Cause
no,
I
I
can't imagine anything.
I
just-
love those stories. You know, I